I don't know. It seems like we're crawling to the finish line. How do you feel about it?
The Dan Yorke State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Takeo Comfort Solutions.
I know my friend Bill Lynch won't agree, but Hillary is crawling to the finish line. Whether she gets there first or not is still anybody's guess. See, he just moved in on the set. Get over there. I haven't introduced you yet. We're loose on this show. Sasse is way over there. He knows how to do this program, for God's sake. Oh, my goodness. It's all right. I don't mind being punchy. Most of you know on the Friday shows that we record them on Thursdays. So if anything is blown up to Kingdom Come in the last 24 hours, we're not going to be able to reflect on it, and I'm hoping nothing blows up. But great to have you aboard. Thank you very much. Tuesday couldn't get here fast enough for, I think, a lot of voters, or at least that's what most of the research says. I don't know. Maybe you're having some kind of perverse joy out of the entertainment value of this election. I'm not so certain. Here's a headline that can be a conversation starter, and then I'll let Mr. Lynch into the shot. Race tightens, Hillary holds narrow lead in New Times CBS poll. And so there you have it. Well, since you put your head in, welcome. It's good to see you.
But I have to say, at least I pulled back. I didn't actually hit you.
No.
I thought about it.
You've been thinking about that for 15 years.
20,
17
20
years. As long as I've been here, for goodness sake. But isn't it Trump that promotes the violence? I didn't know that was...
See that? It's flowing over to everybody
It's festering
now.
At this point. Mr. Sasse, good to see you.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure.
Gary Sasse, of course, former everything in state government, director of revenue, advisor to both the governors and the mayors of Providence, and now at the Bryant Leadership Institute. And you stepped in for the Republican chairman today, and I thank you for doing so. You've never really expressed a formal Republican stature.
Neither has the Republican chairman.
No,
He's not here to defend himself.
well,
But you've never taken a formal role in the party, correct?
no, that's not correct.
Okay, I'm incorrect about that.
I chaired the Rubio.
Can we start this show again? The whole thing has been a mess. I'm kidding.
I know. I chaired the Rubio campaign here, which was the
No,
Republican
that's
primary.
true. No, yeah, okay. I'm talking about party officialdom in terms of, well, okay, that's close enough.
Yeah.
So you qualify. I mean, you're eminently qualified for political dialogue. I just didn't know whether you were of equitable political status with Mr.
I'm sure
Lynch.
I'm not equitable with these guys, but I'm not
The
registered
Republicans
Republican.
must have wanted someone rational and reasonable, so they sent Gary today.
Well, thank you
Rather
very
than
much.
Mr. Bell.
Oh,
It's-
no,
well,
no.
you guys have had some good rat-a-tats.
I think it's more enjoyable watching Brandon and Bill go at it than me and Bill.
Well, yeah, we can get your motor running from time to time. All right, let's just have it. Polls are tightening. There's no doubt about that. The race to 270 electoral votes. Before I hear from him about how it's all going to be okay, you weren't a Trump guy. You were a Kasich guy.
And a Rubio guy.
And a Rubio guy. Kasich first.
No, Rubio first.
Rubio first.
He got
right, he got out.
first.
And, well, I have the Bryant event with John Kasich in my head, which was very well run and really enjoyable,
Thank
and
you.
part of that whole Kasich tour. I will tell you,
He was a good candidate.
I can't tell you how,
Kasich.
if he was running, he would have beat your candidate. I think yes,
Possibly.
possibly.
We'll never know.
You agree?
I think
Rubio would have beat her. Kasich would have beat her.
I think anybody but Trump.
Cruz
would
might have beat her.
Well, Cruz had been closer, but I think the others would have whipped her.
So there's a lot of remorse, isn't there?
Well, you know, it's difficult. We had a real opportunity to nominate, a candidate that would have been very competitive, and Trump captured the party in the primary process. And we can have a long talk about how we need to fix up the method of nominating candidates, but that's a fact. So as you know, have not decided to vote for Trump yet. I have some reservations about that, but he's the nominee of the party. So be it.
Well, it couldn't be easier for you.
It's like when you're in court, you say, I rest my case without even saying anything.
You don't have to. I mean, my position on Trump's not clear.
Yeah, well, listen, I get that.
Well, you know what? I mean, Gary's position, candidly, is very similar to a lot of people and a lot of Republicans. Mr. Trump is a very uncomfortable and difficult candidate to support for a lot of different reasons. Not everywhere in the country, obviously, because, as I said last time I was on this program, there were going to be valleys and peaks for these candidates, but as we get closer to election day, the campaign and the election would get closer. That's what's happened. It's not unusual. Our country's so divided now in terms of the Electoral College and who's going to win what states, and conservatives versus liberals or Democrats, that it's always, at least for the foreseeable future, going to be close every time there's a presidential race, and this will be no different. I still believe, as we sit here, as I said previously, that Hillary Clinton will prevail, but I also said and continue to believe that it will be close, not because of Mr. Trump necessarily, but because of the deep, deep divisions in this country, which Mr. Trump, by the way, to his credit, I guess, has been able to identify and to exploit, that there are some real huge differences and divisions in this country that we need to deal with after January.
And I would give Trump a lot of credit because, as Bill pointed out, he did put real issues on the table. The disappearing working class jobs, stagnant wages, excessive political correctness, social crisis. These liberals on the East and West Coast didn't care that half the people in the Midwest had opiate addictions because they had lost their jobs, their culture had changed for whatever reason. And so Trump has to be given a lot of credit for putting those issues on the table. And in a lot of ways, this has been the most issueless campaign that I can remember, but at least, Trump got there by pointing out what some of the serious problems this country is facing.
But at the same time, Gary, you got to admit that in that whole primary thing, it was only a couple of things. It was the wall.
Immigration.
It was the wall that Mexico was going to pay for, and now, by the way, they're going to reimburse us. Is the new version.
Is that what now?
For the most part, it was the wall, and there's an immigration emphasis to the early part of the campaign, which if you actually looked at the surveys and the polls, it wasn't high up on the concerns of most voters across the table. But a segment has been very concerned about it because they feel like the country's been taken from them.
Right. Well, see, I think the wall was a symbol, and it was a symbol for a feeling on a great many people, both on the right and left, that the country was less secure. I think Obama's foreign policy has been feckless. I think it's been a disaster. I never thought I'd see an American president stand by while genocide happened. In the first Clinton administration, he went into Serbia when genocide was happening. So the wall became a symbol for people feeling insecure. Some of the inability of the president to talk about Islamic terrorism. There were a whole bunch of dog whistles put out by the other side that played right into Trump's hands, and the wall became a symbol for that insecurity.
By the way, you're right. It's a symbol, but the second part, I said there was two things. It was Muslims. So those were the two things that for some reason resonated in this country. And I think, unfortunately, we haven't had a very serious and contemplative conversation about it.
No.
Well, I mean, there's never going to be a wall built that Mexico is going to pay for, and there never should be a situation in this country where we close our borders completely to anyone attempting to come into the country. There's never going to be a situation here where we require a certain religious faith.
You mean a specific anyone?
Correct.
Yeah.
We're never going to require, nor should we require, a specific religious faith to have ID cards different than the rest of us. So, I happen to think that Hillary Clinton has a very strong, good plan with making our country secure and has
You
the
agree with that?
experience.
No, I don't agree. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Bill.
Well, that's all right. And I think she has the experience
interruptions
to
are good.
do
No,
that.
Because see, I look at, there's a record here, so we could talk about her record. And, Hillary Clinton is basically untrustworthy. That's pretty clear from what's happened with the emails and a number of other things. But there's Benghazi, there's the deal with Iran, which she was not Secretary of State when it was completed, but she was involved in the planning of that process. And I have a very difficult time distinguishing the foreign policy failures from the administration and saying Hillary's judgment was good. I think that's a real problem to suggest that she gives us more comfort in foreign policy. The other thing that bothers me a great deal, and I think this is going to be a story next year, is no one's explained why foreign governments and foreign businesses help make Hillary and Bill millionaires. I'd like to get an answer for that, and I think it's first starting to come out, and I think during the next president's term, that will come out further. So we have a lot of foreign government and business involvement and self-enrichment. We have Benghazi, we have the Iran deal, which I think I have questions about, other people have questions about as well. And so that is not a sterling record that gives one a great comfort.
But here's the thing that I find interesting.
Except that you have to compare that to Donald Trump, who first says he knows more than all the generals with regard to anything to do with the military. Then he says if he wins, he's going to convene a group of generals, retired generals, and they're going to advise him as to what to do. Then he says he has a plan, but it's a secret plan for how we're going to defeat ISIS and take over the Middle East.
It's so beautiful that you jumped in, because you didn't argue a single thing that Gary said. All you did was say, okay, but your guy's worse. And that's really where the country has
well, no, I was trying, if it was Brandon Bell, I would have been interrupting and telling him he was wrong, but I'm trying to be diplomatic with Gary, so he comes back again.
No, because I'll be diplomatic. I'll always come back with Bill's here, but I'll be diplomatic with Bill. One of the concerns I have about Trump, his unpredictability comes to foreign policy. I think it's very important that we be predictable with our allies, no surprises if possible. And so the country is really in a Faustian bargain. You have a candidate from one party who's running that I think has I'll say poor record, I will use an adjective but I won't, a record on foreign policy, has a record of insider dealing for self-enrichment, at least for the family business, and then you have another candidate that says, oh, it's great to be unpredictable. The American people lose in that discussion.
Well, so when we come back, we'll talk about it, because a guy on the golf course says to me the other day, he says, Dan, who are you voting for? I said, I don't know. He says, you know what? It comes down to corrupt or crazy. I'll go. I'll tell you when we come back. Stay with us.
You're too
No sidetracks, Donald. Nice and easy. Nice. Because I've been watching Hillary the last few days. She's totally unhinged.
You know, we've been so inundated with him that we're conditioned now to think that's kind of cute and funny. But if you take a half a breath, you think to yourself, there's the candidate who could be the next president of the United States, self-talking himself into remaining calm. And the answer is the golfer, who is, I think, been on both sides of the aisle, said to me, I'll take corrupt over crazy, because they're going to show him that football, and he's going to say, what does this button do? That's what he's telling me on the fourth tee. You know, and so that's kind of where everybody is.
I mean, I think it's a legitimate concern, and I don't think that the campaign and the election is going to be decided solely on the issue of foreign policy, obviously, but you know, when you have Donald Trump and the thought that he would, with his temperament and what we've seen from him just in the last several months on the campaign trail, be in charge of whether or not, you know, we should use nuclear weapons. It's a frightening thought. I mean, he's said that, so if North Korea, you know, and China get involved in a nuclear dispute, what's the big deal? That kind of thinking is dangerous for everybody, and I think ought to give everybody pause when they start thinking hard about who they want to vote for if you haven't already voted.
So what do? You who are struggling?
Well, I will probably write it a candidate. I will write it a Republican, because I think Hillary Clinton is totally unfit to be president of the United States.
What about this notion that you vote for Gary Johnson because if the Libertarians grab 5% in Rhode Island, then they'll be on the ballot for 2018, and we've got more party diversity? I mean, I've been kind of talking about that on the radio.
Except that, keep in mind that just yesterday we saw and heard a very eloquent, strong, very specific endorsement of Hillary Clinton by Bill Weld, who's the vice presidential candidate on the Libertarian ticket. So I think that speaks volumes about Hillary
Clinton.
Her
character. Talked about his work experience with her, and so nobody's the same with everybody. So maybe in his wheelhouse, he has seen things that he feels good about.
Well, I dealt with Bill Weld when I was director of administration. Bill was working for an investment bank, and I think he's an interesting guy. I think he was a good governor of Massachusetts, and I also think he's a little flaky about some things. But it's a tough choice. I think we have to have serious conversations after this election of how we deal with the nominating process.
You don't like my idea of running in the Libertarians?
No, because
of choosing Libertarians?
No, because I don't think the Libertarian candidate necessarily distinguished himself.
There's no doubt about that. But I'm talking about for other motives. They get to rise the party up, give us a third-party choice for 2018.
You know, the problem with that thinking is, and I don't mean just by you, although that frightens me too, but in general, the problem with that thinking...
You don't have to take shots like that, those are gratuitous shots.
I lived through the Ralph Nader, Al Gore, George Bush situation, and I knew Ralph Nader personally. I was the chair of the party at the time, as you know, and dealt with him on a lot of issues. And Ralph was intent on going forward and running, even though there was no one, including Ralph, who thought he would actually win. And the aftermath is that those third-party candidates who have every right to run, and I don't dispute that at all, but realistically, when you get down to the final analysis, if they're able to peel off enough votes, sometimes it has just the opposite effect of what it is they're trying to accomplish.
That's interesting.
Then the best example is Ross Perot.
I mean, if not, just to finish that thought, if Ralph Nader hadn't been in that contest, I don't think anybody disputes that Al Gore is the president of the United States, and that whether you were with Bush or Gore, that change would have changed the entire direction of the country for the next 10, 15, 20 years.
The best example I was going to mention is Ross Perot. Ross Perot ran as a fiscal conservative, got I think 19% of the vote, and if Ross Perot wasn't in the race, I'm pretty sure Bush would have been Clinton.
Yeah.
And I think in a lot of ways Bush's views and Perot's views were closer. The other thing too is I am glad that Ross Perot wasn't president, because there's some real value in the two-party system. We as Republicans have a lot of work to do to fix the party up and get it focused, and you're going to see things happen after the election, whether Trump wins or not, of party building.
That's the other thing I was struggling with. To your strategic point, Gary's dilemma, Gary's not a Clinton, maybe. He just can't do it. So him writing in somebody else other than Donald Trump helps you. Now, of course, all of this is in Rhode Island context, but a friend of mine this morning says, my son is a Bernie Sanders, and he's going to write in Bernie Sanders, and I don't know how to explain to him that that's going to hurt us, meaning the country, because she can't vote for Trump. A Bernie Sanders write-in key states helps Trump.
Yeah, but they see that
because it's a subtraction from Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, and the easy answer to that question is have her son listen to what Bernie Sanders says about this election.
Vote for Hillary.
And Bernie has made it very clear that in his
but
opinion, at this point,
the math is a subtraction. A vote for Bernie Sanders is a half a vote for Donald Trump,
right?
I
think, well, there are really 50 state elections. If I lived in Florida or Ohio or Iowa, I might well vote for Trump, because then the choice becomes more important. I live in Rhode Island. I can be ideologically, consistent, and not worry about my vote helping Hillary Clinton. In Florida, I have to worry about that.
Huh. That is such a situational analysis. That's interesting. I don't know. We've all gone through it. I mean, I've come up with this libertarian concoction because I can't pull or fill in the dot for either one of them myself. You're suggesting that if I'm in Ohio, I got to make a choice. Well, I got to make a choice.
You don't have to make a choice.
Either that, or we can try to get all the Republicans that live in Rhode Island to move to Florida or somewhere else. I hadn't thought of that.
It's not good for the economy, Bill. that's not. Since we should be seen. Well, not we. I'm not affiliated.
He wants to run the last 3 businesses out of the state.
Yeah, some folks got to pay the taxes that you want to spend on all your liberal programs. When we come back, a little bit more on this and some of the local races that are of interest and importance. Stay with us.
Are we going to build a confident, optimistic, inclusive America that will make us stronger and fairer and better? Or are we going to hunker down, afraid of each other, afraid of the future, and go backwards instead of forwards?
Well, we have those choices. We were talking.
She looks pretty presidential right there to me.
Oh, no. It looks a little loud, screaming.
What? Well, you know what? I think we got to be careful with that. And I have to check myself on that too, because gender gets in the way sometimes of our analysis. And I think, not to be politically correct, but I think you have to be conscientious that gender does play a role in this. And sometimes we guys are a little bit too tough on women who are trying to make an emphatic point.
Maybe she was trying to imitate Trump.
Well, listen. Right now, I'd be surprised.
I didn't see her groping anybody.
Huh?
I didn't see her groping.
That's
anybody.
really not a vision that I want to get into anyway. Given, I'll leave that.
What were you saying?
I'll leave that there. What I'm saying is, what's interesting is how parties, and you were talking about the two-party system, Gary. The parties are going to have to regroup, both of them, after this. And the Democrats run a superdelegate process, which helped them to maintain a philosophy and a candidate that had a maybe potentially winning formula. the Republicans don't have a superdelegate thing and lost control of their party.
We have to look at that. We have to look at closing our primaries. We have to look at the order in which we have primary
Republicans
elections.
should be closing primaries in Rhode Island. They've been saying that for years and years and years. And the legislature, you know, first of all, they won't bring it, and secondly, the Democratic legislature probably won't let them have it.
And I think politically they would not want to publicly.
Right? Would you oppose that if the Republicans in Rhode Island wanted to close their primaries?
I didn't know we had Republican primaries in Rhode
Oh,
Island.
well, just stop it. Would you oppose that?
Closing Republican primaries?
Letting the Republicans close their primaries, allowing that legislation to pass the General Assembly.
I honestly have to say I don't know what the party position would be on that. I really don't know.
Think the party
I've never had a discussion about it in 15 years.
I think the party would be opposed to closing the primary. That would be my guess.
The Democrats opposed to the Republicans, or the Republicans?
The Republicans probably would oppose it because there's really an education process.
The Republicans are not thinking straight.
No, there's an education process that we
I
have
knew we would agree on something sooner or later.
It
took 15 years.
But he's wrong. But there's an education process that one has to go through, because for the last 100 years in this country, we've done everything to small d democratize the nomination process, and a lot of it was good. You know, no one's suggesting we just go to the Blackstone Hotel in Chicago in the back room, and when the smoke is white, we know who the nominee is. No one's suggesting that at all. But you could democratize the process to such an extent that somebody who's not in your party
you lose the
captures
identity of the party, and you open it up to bad actors. You know how that works. Nick Mattiello, does he survive?
It's going to be very close. I don't know. I think Steve has run a great campaign. Yes, and I don't know that district well enough, but I think Steve has a program that challenges the status quo. Nick's leadership, his judgment, the breakdown and oversight of the General Assembly, just following Raimondo on everything, are real serious questions about what's happening up there.
Well, the Speaker hasn't followed Gina Raimondo on everything. We've talked about that now for the last 2 or 3 weeks, almost nonstop. There have been many differences between the two of them. I think he gets reelected because I think that he spent his life in that district in Cranston. I think the local people know who he is and can sort through a lot of the noise that has been thrown up about him during this campaign. Will it be close? Probably will be close. I've said to you before, he lives in a district that, you know, leans certainly independent. There are many Republicans by Rhode Island standards in that district, so it's a kind of district that would be challenging for him. But I think people are going to recognize as we get closer that he's done a great job as Speaker, and they'll reelect him.
Well, there are two numbers, and we don't have numbers for that district, but we have numbers statewide. Only a third of the people think the state's heading in the right direction. And 2/3 of the people think they're less financially well off today than they were a year ago.
The problem with those, though, Gary, is that, and I saw this the time I was the chair, is that people say that statewide. I don't dispute that.
They vote for their own guy.
But they like their own rep because they know him. And the people in that district know Nick Mattiello. They know what he's done, what he's committed to do for them in that district. So I think he gets reelected.
We're out of time. I have 15 seconds here. How does the presidential race turn out in Rhode Island?
I think Rhode Island helps put Hillary.
What's the number?
Numbers? I don't care if she wins by 1 vote, as long as she wins.
Hillary will probably win, and I imagine the Republicans will get somewhere between 35 and 38% of the vote.
Yeah, but that last comment reflects the entire campaign, it seems to me, crawling to the finish line. Final word, we come back.
It doesn't matter, as long as you get across it first.
See? So whether Hillary's calling to the finish line or we are, Monday we'll have our final political scientists roundtable and prediction for Tuesday. And yes, Virginia, there will be an election day. Have a great weekend. Bye.